the handy thing about doing a podcast, which is focusing on Jungian stuff, is that's a lot of stuff. He had ideas about a lot of things.
Which is why he's rejected by modern contemporary psychology, because he was wide-ranging instead of very narrow, like contemporary psychology, which is extraordinarily narrow.
That's true. It's antithetical to that paradigm of specialization, which has only become more specialized when it comes to the developments with more biologically centered psychology. We're literally focusing on certain areas of the brain and what they're doing when people are having certain experiences. It just gets more and more specialized, it seems.
There's lab psychology, laboratories, men in white coats psychology, and mice and
Very,
dogs and
very
things.
far removed from exploring universal archetypes.
They don't acknowledge. There's a moment in one of Jordan Peterson's podcasts when he says he was warned in his early on in his career never to say the word mention Jung, because that's death for his career. No one will touch him with a barge pole. It's a bit like having sympathy for Palestinians. It's like not allowed to by the. Oh, but of course, all he ever did is talk about Jung, so obviously managed to survive. But it's interesting just what hostility the psychological community as a whole have towards Jung. You think maybe they just forget about him, or they're actually actively hostile, and to be associated with anything that Jung says is the mark of its kiss of death, which is interesting, isn't it? How they have actually taken such a hugely.
One way I would possibly look at that would be that I believe people all have a built-in intellectual immune system, so to speak. Everyone's walking around with their own Weltanschauung, their own worldview, and they're not all compatible. Different Weltanschauungs are not compatible with others. So we have to have these sort of immune systems that, because if I was to completely take in an incompatible worldview from someone, it would obviously undermine my view of reality and destabilize my whole personality, my whole motivational framework. It would,
so you can't afford to be open to everything, in other words.
Psychologically, it would be basically a form of death.
It's like shooting yourself in the foot in a big way, really. You couldn't continue in the way. You'd have lost the integrity of your core belief or your core paradigm or whatever it was that's motivating you, as you say.
I think might have been Ken Wilber or maybe someone else, but it might have been Ken Wilber who said something like, we can only ever call into question something like 10%, 5% or 10% of our worldview at any given time. It's just, I'm not sure if that's 100% accurate, but the gist is accurate. But the idea of that we can't subject too much of our basic assumptions about reality to real scrutiny, and because it's too destabilizing.
It's like saying we actually have to have a blind spot, an area which we don't see and can't see in order to function at all. Ignorance, the core of ignorance, really, isn't it? About
we have to have assumptions. We need assumptions to walk out the door and to function in a basic way.
To have some basic, some kind of idea of what's what. Like an orientation, really, isn't it? Because how do you know what's up and what's down and which way is out of the front door? And without that basic orientation,
who am I? Where am I going? What's valuable? What is worth ignoring? What's worth paying attention to? None of that's obvious. None of these aren't obvious things that you could just logically show someone the answer to these questions. So that would be one angle would be that Jung's view is on a very basic level a threat to certain dominant worldviews, which wouldn't be too hard to. I'm not saying that's true, but it's one possibility why there would be such a vehement resistance to just someone's ideas. Another one would be, obviously, there's a lot of political stuff, which I try and avoid as much as I can. I don't know how much of that is an influence. How much of it is it really, because that's often an angle which is taken with the reason why Nietzsche is not. Although a lot of people, like, how is Nietzsche taught in universities these days?
He is in a philosophy course for sure. I think
because a lot of people bring up whatever controversy about certain fascist movements adopting his ideas to some bad ends.
And they say people have said, oh, he kind of like leaning towards fascism. without any justification, I think, because he actually held the SS and the Gestapo in contempt. He had not much nice things to say about them. He said about the classic SS officer that they were basically long legs and obedience. So when you think about it, it's probably a good description of them.
Yeah, I
They
mean,
do,
yeah,
you
I
know, they're
think
totally obedient, no mind of their own, and long legs,
sure.
all in uniform.
But yeah, I mean, it's we obviously ad hominem attacks are well, people use that strategy for a reason, because if I can attack your character, then I don't need to try and argue with you. I don't need to take your view seriously and potentially have it affect me, have it destabilize my view of reality. If I can just call you a certain name, attack some aspect of your character, and just that allows me to dismiss you as a valid any of your ideas as being potentially valid. So it's a very it's a very frequently used tactic by people.
In politics as well, of course, as well as in science. If you can't attack someone in a basic, honest way, you spread rumors about them, keep on spreading them until that, and again, the guy
And,
sinks.
and
Jeremy Corbyn, he was accused of anti-Semitism till the end he was drummed out of town. But a lot of people say, well, that's unfair. He spent his whole life talking about protecting minorities and stuff like that. It's not really a fair, justified thing, but it got rid of him because it's such a taint. So if you can put a taint on someone,
it seems to be just the go-to strategy for dealing with political enemy or anyone you don't like, really. But to me, that nearly I nearly relate that to the same thing, this idea of you're having a psychological immune system that sort of there's this sort of
automatically defends you
yes.
without even you knowing that you're defending yourself. It does it for you. It's like the immune system kicks in, and you don't have to be aware of what lies behind it, or you just feel this feeling of this is a bad person, or this is an evil person, or the devil is behind these people, and you just so straight away you're not ever going to hear anything from that point of view, I suppose. The demonizing is probably maybe the most classic way, because if you say, well, they're the devil, that pretty much disempowers them because you wouldn't listen to anything the devil says, would you, if the devil's
Mm.
behind them? So no matter how persuasive, and also they say the devil is very persuasive. So even if you're speaking with the persuasiveness of the truth, they'll just say, oh, that's even more proof you're a Satan worshiper because
Yes,
that's
there's endless ways that we can protect our beliefs. We can protect our views, and we go to pretty extreme lengths to do that. Which, like, that's one of the things Jordan Peterson has talked about is one of his main motivations for studying human psychology and actually depth psychology and Jung and stuff was he was very curious, might be the wrong word. He was deeply disturbed by World War II, the events of World War II, and just couldn't really understand how these things happened. How did all of the atrocities that happened in World War II? How were these things? How did people allow these things to happen? And so that was one of
go
the
along with it and go along with it and be part of it, even to be
yes,
part of that kind of social epidemic or whatever it was. Yeah,
and
that's a topic for psychological investigation, isn't it? It really is a good topic
should
for
be.
psychology.
Yeah, I mean, it really should be something because they have obviously this thing of do not forget. But like Jordan Peterson makes the point, it's not enough to say do not forget. You have to say do not forget what aren't we to forget? Because if we didn't understand the phenomenon, the thing that happened, what are we remembering? You know,
Yeah, it becomes something we assume we're remembering it, but if we pressed, we couldn't say what exactly it was. It's just a notion, a slogan or a motto or something. Lest we
yeah, and
forget. That's what they say,
Jung
isn't
had
it?
some pretty wild ideas about some of the things that might have been happening from a depth psychological perspective. He actually has this idea that the German people became possessed by the archetype of Wotan, Odin.
Hey, I
Uh,
didn't realize that because I thought Odin and Wotan were different.
it's the same. It's just
Father
the
God.
change of the name across time. It became Wotan
Hey,
became Vodin, dropped the
hey,
V. But yes, and he is a god of fury, a god of. I'm trying to think of the right word here. Obviously, a war god, but a god of fury and a kind of like a berserk kind of state of mind.
It's
you
quite
know,
a powerful kind of force then, really.
yeah, so his idea was that the collective consciousness of the German people became obsessed, possessed by this archetype. And somehow this is Hitler somehow was tapping into an archetypal, a sort of archetypal need in the population. He's got some ideas that basically there was something happening in like the collective unconscious in relationship to, which is a pretty wild thing to speculate on, obviously, because how you can't exactly prove it. But the
There
idea
could
of
be events occurring within the
the idea
collective
of
unconscious.
archetypal possession on a collective level doesn't seem too if it can happen on an individual level, on the scale of an individual, then surely you could imagine it happening on a larger scale.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of one aspect of Jung's way of talking about things that comparatively recently hit home to me just how threatening it is to mainstream approaches to psychology. And that has to do with possession, because possession isn't a word we like to use in
Mm.
modern 21st century psychiatry. It's not,
Out of favor.
it's out of favor, possession. But Jung talks about, for example, possession by the persona, which I remember whatever of his volumes that comes from. There's a whole section on. I think it's the archetype and the collective unconscious. And he talks about how the persona is a mask we wear, obviously, and that's easy enough to understand. But what we don't understand is that the mask becomes the master and it grows onto our face and we can't rip it off again. So it's basically become a parasitic possessing entity, even though it isn't a conscious entity of its own right. It somehow,
It has autonomy.
yeah, it has autonomy, exactly, yeah.
It has its
So
own.
the
It has its
idea,
own discrete agenda, discrete from the rest of the ego.
yeah,
Actually, the word
what was,
possession, he used a word, Ergriffenheit, which is a German word, when he talked about how complexes affected people. And Ergriffenheit translates to possession. So that's his chosen metaphor for when someone has an activated complex, is this idea of possession. So it's a fitting metaphor because people are taken over by something, and they lose their ordinary view of reality, and they lose control to this sort of alien force within them.
and they'd be if you knew them, they'd be acting a bit strange, and you'd be thinking, "What's up with them?" They've got, they're acting uncharacteristically, and they would be a different person, in
There'd be
fact,
a
wouldn't they? When you look
shift.
right
There'd be a
into it,
shift over to a totally different personality.
and once you go down the road of possession, you can widen it a little bit because you can start looking. This is what occurred to me anyway, that you could look at the whole of psychology in terms of us being possessed, not necessarily by a persona, but also by different types of egos or different, that basically that human beings are a bit like if you've got a smartphone and you haven't got any apps on it, it's just a shell. It has nothing, it's not, it hasn't got that functionality. But you download all the apps and then these apps are generic things. They're floating around us like ideas are generic. They're floating around and they can get lodged and then we think it's our idea, which is an idea in sociology. They talk about false spontaneity where you suddenly burst out with this opinion with loads of vehemence, as if it's your opinion, you invented it, and as if it's totally not something that's been you've heard loads and loads of times, like an old cliche. So somehow this cliche for you becomes as if it's the first time anyone's ever said it, and it's also incredibly put to the point and incredibly meaningful. And yet all you've done is be a mouthpiece for some banal banal idea or prejudice that has social currency, but it takes us over. And when it takes us over, one of the signs of this is that everything we say is as if we are really saying it and we really stand by it, instead of the fact that an extrinsic element has subverted it to its own ends, just like a virus subverts a cell to its own ends. We never realize. So if you take that as an idea of how human psychology works, we're basically a host for all sorts of things that infest us and direct us in lots of ways. And we're totally clueless, even when different infesting or infecting elements totally contradict each other. And one will say the opposite and do the opposite of the other. So the result of it is total chaos, but also total inauthenticity.
Yeah, what
And
you're saying is very much lines up with Jung's idea of the idea that the ordinary person is, for all intents and purposes, governed by the collective consciousness of that's around them. They're responding to environmental stimuli, and the thoughts that they have, the feelings they have, their behaviors don't come from any real place, any real authentic place of inside of them. They're just the result of this external stimulus. I mean, he was very like this for him was a very sad realization, and he made him feel after he had this realization. I think it was around the time where he was writing the Red Book and going through that whole process.
that was his particular point,
Yes, he,
where people say he was mad, he had to go away by himself and
it
grips
was
with it.
like in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, or his memoir, he talks about how he was at a point where he had a pistol in his bedside drawer, and he was at the point where he was actually threatening his unconscious, saying, "If you don't sort this out, I'm going to end it." And that's in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, because
Yeah, I don't remember that.
yeah, he was basically drowning in the unconscious. He was having these waking visions
Mm.
and it was intense affective experiences, visionary experiences, apocalyptic rivers of blood, just really crazy stuff that most people would definitely think they've lost it and probably contacted a doctor and being put in a psych ward. But and Jung was at one point genuinely concerned because he had seen things similar to this.
Schizophrenic patients, he would have seen
So he
schizophrenic
was
patients.
genuinely concerned that he has something has triggered this like a schizophrenic latent schizophrenia or something. But no, he went, and then later, it's also part of the reason why original classic Jungians have a very ambivalent attitude towards the unconscious, where they don't fully trust it. They're not universally trusting and believing in the positive, benevolent nature of the unconscious. And that's part of this stems from the fact that Jung himself had quite an ambivalent attitude towards it, at least partially related to these experiences where he was completely overwhelmed by his unconscious. And even though he says that essentially through these experiences and working with these experiences, it has formed the basis of his whole psychology. The Red Book is the basis of his whole later psychological ideas about the human being and reality. So it was obviously enlightening, but it was also terrible. It was terrible and contributes his belief in this idea of the dark side of the self. And there's a lot of, I'm very much simplifying it. It's not like you can say that was just entirely related to those experiences, but they definitely played a role from what I have seen anyway. And how could it not? How could it not play?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, those are the things which determine everything, really. And without an experience like that, you can't actually say anything, pretty much, really, can you? If you only have the experience of the world that is a reflection of conventional understanding, what can you talk about apart from that collective understanding? And we all know that anyway because it's collective. So it becomes nothing. It's like if you're totally socially adapted, there's nothing you can say that's really unexpected or
But the point,
interesting,
I
really.
guess, the point is that in terms of breaking away from the collective, him going into these very idiosyncratic, these personal, going into his own unconscious and learning about things, learning about the nature of reality through his own unconscious is a good example of you kind of have to break away from this consensual reality in order to do that. You have to go deep within yourself somehow. That's the information comes, and even I mean that's a very extreme example, but even someone who is allows themselves to be more influenced by things like intuition or whatever dream interpretation, different endogenous forms of knowledge that is coming from within your psyche versus
from
what the
outside.
environment is telling you to do. It very much relates to the process of Jung's idea about individuation, separating from the collective by finding some kind of a private source, a personal source of knowledge and direction somehow within
Yeah,
yourself. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's like Alan Watts talking about intuition. He's saying, look, it's tuition from within.
that's great. I
You've been
haven't heard
taught. Yeah,
that. That's
it's
good.
one
Yeah.
of his neat little things. But what I'm struck by in more recent times is how almost everybody you meet that might have experience and training and lots of, I don't know, lots of education. But what struck me more and more, maybe this is particularly true within healthcare professions, all of that training and it's all absorbed, whether you're at university, it's absorbed from the outside in. So if that's the case, you're an extension of that knowledge system. You are an individual self. You're an extension of this generic system. So no matter how great you are, you're like a little projection that's been projected from the system because everything in you is in the system because the system put it in you. And if at any time, especially for doctors, especially even more so for psychiatrists, but for all doctors, if you start wandering off and saying things that are in not total coherence with what the rest of the profession is, it's really threatening to the profession if you break ranks and start thinking. And so you have to be really careful about the line you tread if you're a clinical psychologist or if you're a doctor. Because even with general GPs, I know in Ireland that GPs that put a different version of how we should best deal with COVID, they lost their jobs the next day and they were never re-employed. Why? Because they're looking at it from a different angle. So it's something, even though we have trust in all the experts, it's very narrow. And there's something weird about the fact that you abdicate your own responsibility to be a mouthpiece for what is essentially a dead matrix of knowledge, which has no way of changing because to change it, it's automatically an error. And error is eliminated. So you become a mechanical thing. And mechanical things, there's a right way and a wrong way for every mechanical thing. But for human beings, of course, there is no right way and a wrong way. It's like if a toaster burns a toaster crisp, you say, bloody toaster's wrong. So, that's an error, and you fix it. For
Mm.
humans, it's not simple as that. But in a mechanical environment, which is like the metaphor of making a machine that is so good, it takes over our thinking, it takes over everything, it becomes our world, which is a very old story in fairy tale terms. I know you could say, okay, it's like Terminator. It's also like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, because what's some people say it's the very first science fiction story written in 18, whatever it is, 1880, because science has hubris and it decides to create life. And it can do that, but then the consequences are very dire, very kind of dark. And the same thing in more old-fashioned, ancient kind of myths, like the fairy tale of the magic porridge pot, which I was struck by, which is an old, I think it's German, but it's definitely in the fairy tale, Grimm's fairy tales, where there's this poor girl, mum, and the mum's got no part, she's got no part in this, they're all poor, and she's so hungry she has to go walking in the woods every day in the big wood that they used to have in Germany, the great Black Forest, just to distract herself from the hunger pangs. And one day she sees this kind of old lady who kind of beckons her over and says, "Don't be frightened. I'm going to give you a present of this kind of magic porridge pot. All you have to say is this little formula, it'll make porridge, much as you want." And then you say another formula, it stops again. So she takes it home, shows her mum that they have lots to eat, and maybe a few neighbours as well. They say, "Come and have some porridge." And it's all great. But then one day the girl goes off again. It's turning into a more long-winded story than I thought.
That's okay.
She goes off,
I mean, a lot of these
and
fairy tales are quite long.
yeah, yeah. And the mum thinks, "Oh, I wouldn't mind a bit of porridge." So she says, "Cook, porridge pot cook," or whatever the hell it is. And loads of porridge comes in it. And she eats to her heart content, but she don't know how to, she doesn't know the other word. So it just keeps coming in the end. The house is full of porridge, the doors burst open, it goes out. And all the villages are in danger of being completely engulfed in porridge, and people are up to there in porridge. And it's all very scary. And then just then the girl comes back and she says the magic phrase, and the porridge pot stops. But it's very similar to other stories where you might have a sweeping brush that sweeps by itself, but you don't know how to stop it, and then it becomes a menace because it's sweeping everything. You can't stop it, and it's kind of freaky and scary. Or another one where you summon a demon, which is a really common one.
Mm.
You can't banish him again. Say, "Come here, demon. I want you to do this," but you don't know the second half of the banish. So the basic idea is that the mechanical world, which is a construct of thought, we make it, and we're quite clever to make it. It's like, wow, look what we made, but we can't turn it off. And what the mechanical world does, it possesses us and turns us into offshoots or copies or duplicates of itself. So we are just extensions of that mechanical world. We can't turn it off. And the reason we can't turn it off, one deep reason, is that we are it. And we don't really want to turn it off because that'd be the end of us, because we are the machine, mechanical. We're the machine's representation of ourselves, not ourselves. And so if we were to turn it off, that'd be the end of the machine's representation of ourselves, like a little simulation that's running of us. And we think that's all we are, so we're totally frightened of that. So that is I don't know how on earth I started going on that tack. But
Well, I'm following a train of thought.
yeah. So that's a good example of how you can understand that fairly easy through mythology and fairy tales and current fiction. Terminator, the rise of the machines. Yeah, I get that. I get that. But in strictly narrow psychological terms, lab psychology, what you can prove, what can be empirically proved, you'd never get there because you're not broad enough. Your scope isn't broad enough to draw in all that other stuff to help you make sense of what's going on. So as a result, you have this situation where humanity is, or at least the kind of more rational Western materialist side of humanity, is suffering very greatly. Suffering in ways we don't really
Mm.
appreciate because when you look around people on the street, they're putting on. But underneath all this, there is a lot of suffering, I would say. And there's this classic catastrophe, massive catastrophe going on where we've been rationalized and possessed by the thinking mind. Total, absolute possession. And when we try and solve the problem, we're using the thinking mind to try and solve it. So we come up with all this and stuff that contemporary psychology comes out with, which is actually not the cure for the situation, but an actual a way of digging an even deeper hole for us. It's not.
Mm.
It seems to be the cure, but when we go with it and we do the rational therapies and we think about things in a rational way, we're becoming more possessed than ever, less autonomous than ever, and we have zero autonomy because we don't have any existence outside of the simulation that the machine is simulating.
Yeah, it can't be solved from that level.
It can't be solved from
I
that
don't know
level,
what
but
that
it's
if that's a genuine quote, but was that that's the that quote of problems that you can't solve problems from the level that they were created. I'm not sure who that's
Einstein said
really.
that. I mean, Einstein said everything apparently. I know.
Someone said it. Someone said it. It's a good quote.
Someone said it was Einstein that said it. They probably thought, here's a good quote. If I say Einstein said it,
I just don't
people will,
believe any of these
at
quotations
this
anymore.
stage,
Somebody
at
said
this
it, and
stage,
if it's a good quote, then it doesn't really
yeah.
matter who said it.
I think people say Einstein, obviously, because that gives the ultimate credibility.
What strikes me though is if you look at the difference between so what Carl Jung was talking about with individuation, that there's this imperative to break away from the collective level of thought and experience and to find some center within yourself from which to generate an authentic life from, and also from which to really as the only real ultimately the only really credible source of truth, which is diametrically opposed to the standard scientific view, which is that we will arrive at the truth through consensus, that there is, which is part of the ideals of the scientific method, is something is publicly knowable.
Agreed upon.
We can replicate it and we create a consensus, and this is the basis for knowledge about reality. And it's interesting how it's Jung's view, which obviously isn't unique to, it's also common throughout basically every mystical tradition, isn't it? And
Every mystical
occult
tradition there ever
occult
was.
traditions, they all say in order to know the truth, you have to go within. But it's completely opposite to the idea that the gold standard for public public knowledge or publicly accessible, objective, if you want to have the objective facts, it's interesting that's just completely the opposite. And I can obviously see the value in the scientific method. I'm not, I wouldn't be someone who go, yeah, let's go back to the like the
Medieval ages
exactly, yeah,
or
let's just
whatever.
throw
Yeah.
away the scientific method. But it is interesting that there is, because of the success of science, it's maybe there's some babies that have been thrown out with some bathwater along the way, where we're so enamored by the science and the scientific method and all of the stuff that it's done for us, that we forget that, there might actually be something to those older ideas of finding truth within yourself,
Yeah.
and that being somehow a valid source of knowing, which is,
Yeah. Finding truth within yourself comes down to wisdom. Wisdom cannot be produced, can it? Wisdom cannot be, there can't be a process to end up producing wise people the same way you produce people with MSCs or PhDs.
yeah, it could be related to like even the whole Kantian revolution in philosophy, which is still, that still holds sway. This idea that this kind of very hard epistemological skepticism in a way, or like pessimism, or this idea that you actually can't know reality. And but I mean, that sword cuts both ways. I mean, that's if you're looking at the Kantian view about how you can never know the thing in itself. You can only ever know your subjective experience of
Exceptions
it.
and yeah,
That surely that cuts both ways. That wouldn't necessarily put a public knowledge over private knowledge, or like public epistemology over private epistemology. But yeah, so I'm not sure if that was the right thread to pull on. But in general, there is just massive skepticism, and obviously there's lots of reasons for understanding skepticism about humans' ability to be deceived, to deceive ourselves, to misperceive things, the sort of the potential pitfalls of subjectivity. Classic things like when people are asked about events that happen, like car crashes and things, and people will give totally different answers, even though they're in the exact same situation. So there is a kind of it's not too difficult to make arguments that will throw doubt on the idea of subjective knowledge, but it's also like very much, I guess it denies the possibility that there is any valid form of subjective knowing about reality.
it does. And there used to be a branch of psychology based on using yourself as your material. It was called, and now they're still psychologists are still taught it on courses as a kind of a curious little chapter in the history where what psychologists do. And I think this was back in the 1880s or whatever. They used to look at themselves and study themselves, but they gave up on that because even though it's very fruitful, there's no way of being scientific about it. What I've heard it said, and I'm sure there's truth in it, that at that time physics was making huge steps and that psychology wasn't, and they were jealous. So they wanted to be like psychology, and they said it was like the equivalent of penis envy, only it's physics envy. They were looking at physics and thinking, oh God, they've solved so many things, why can't we do it? And they tried to do that by making themselves very objective to eliminate the subjective element. By doing that, they also scuppered themselves by trying to reach out and be what they're not, because physics is never going to be psychology and psychology is never going to be physics. So that would be one explanation. They're trying to be a science, pure science, and a
Yeah,
very
hard science.
hard science, yeah, super hard science. But you can't do that. You can look at electrons in a cloud chamber, but you can't look at archetypes or you can't look at anything. It's kind of a very tricky thing to try and
You
be
can't
objective
weigh
about.
emotions. You can't
Yeah. Kind of,
measure a subjective trauma.
and they say, how are you good are you feeling today on a scale of 1 to 10? That is not really hard
Because
science.
the closest thing is, which is what is really being doggedly pursued at the moment, and can seem, I mean, it's obviously it's going to lead to some really great medical advances that are probably going to help a lot of people studying correlation between emotion and the brain. But because you can show me a picture of activity in the brain, but that's not exactly evidence that you actually understand anything. You just know that part of the brain activates when someone is having a certain experience. It doesn't tell you about the origin of the emotion or the affect, or it's that is part of the
Look at
same
it from
thing
the
as
outside, isn't it? You can look at it from the outside. If you do brain scans, I think you have to inject dyes and things and do proper CT scans on a brain of someone peaking on LSD. You say, wow, the brain is lightened up in all these areas. It's not doing its characteristic stuff, which is just a repeat of the same things. The whole thing is lighting up. And you say, wow, that's great. But you can't, from seeing that, you can't feel what that guy felt when he was actually
mm.
peaking on LSD.
It's actually
And he couldn't explain
funnily
it.
Funny you say that though, because it's actually when it comes to psychedelics, they've shown now, from what I've seen, that it's actually the opposite. The psychedelics reduce brain activity. There's some little nuance there where there's some particular, from very specific form of brain activity, which has like a slight increase, very slight increase, but over
The alpha waves and the beta
on the
waves and all
whole,
that kind of.
these like systemically, brain activity is reduced massively, which is completely runs totally contrary to what you would expect to find based on more kind of typical theories about what's generating these experiences. But that's anyway, that's a complete, that's totally outside above my pay grade. But I have seen some very intelligent people breaking down those studies, and there is very, you would completely assume, because we're so conditioned to think of experiences being generated by the brain, you would definitely just assume that if there's more extreme experience, there should be more extreme, there should be activity that correlates with that.
Yeah, yeah.
But
That's kind of,
it's not actually the case from what I have seen.
yeah.
It's-
I know what they say is beta waves are associated with anxiousness and alert, with kind of being on edge and vigilant, and alpha waves are associated with something else. And both of those waves peter out. Because I know, so the happiest guy in the world. I don't know if you ever heard of the happiest guy in the world. He's a French geneticist professor, and he also happened to give up his job as a geneticist, went to Himalayas, meditated for 10 years, and doing a lot of meditation, obviously, because if you're in the Himalayas and you're going there to meditate, probably not much else you'd be doing.
mm,
But anyway, then he was hooked up to loads of electrodes. This was back in the early 2000s, I think. And from whatever, they were saying, oh, this guy's so happy. He's the happiest guy in the world. And all these newspapers were out. Here's a picture of the brain waves of the happiest guy in the world. But the one thing they did say is that is, what was it? I think it is gamma waves were up, which is associated with creativity more than an analytic process. But I think that kind of relates to the negative and positive philosophical paradigms, where in the negative philosophical paradigm, stuff comes through us, kind of that we're like that quote from what's his name about the
Tesla.
Nikolai Tesla.
Mm,
Being a receiver is a quiet kind of thing, isn't it? Being creative is a quiet kind of thing because it has to come into you from wherever to come out. We don't strain and produce and manufacture the creative process ourselves. It needs, we have to step back in a way for something. So there is this kind of idea of being quiet, being the most interesting or most fertile manifestation of the brain, really, when it's doing that. And that if you're a real artist, you could probably see that the same thing is happening. They're receiving, they're not projecting. And when we do project, we create a prison from ourselves. I think our projections are a deadly trap. As we see them, automatically we're set up to believe they're true. So we don't look any further than them. And then we're living within a cage of our own, whatever thoughts we had, that just stays reality forever. And we're kind of frozen in this mental kind of picture. And that's a result of not having valuing information coming in from the world. It's like what you're saying about the environment, because the environment, we become like ghosts manipulated by an environment, triggered by the environment with no autonomous existence at all. And if we're existing in this kind of simulation state with no autonomous existence, but being told what to think and told what to believe, and yet perceive it's us, that's a very, that's not a great situation to be in, psychologically speaking. Healthier, it's not whole. We're not really being ourselves in some way, in a lot of ways, in every way.
yeah, but it's just interesting that that relates to this conflict where these days most people think that if you want to know about reality, you look to science. Science tells you about reality. But the problem is science tells you about a lot of things, but it's not going to tell you, it's not going to give you direction in life. It's not going to
It
give
can't
you,
tell you. People want a book of how to say, how to live life, what to do, what things are good,
yeah,
and on
what's,
the internet, it's what people are getting. It's like
yeah,
life.
where should I go? Who should I marry? What should I do for a
Yeah,
living?
religion will do you that.
What should
Yeah,
I,
religion can tell you that. Even if you're in that right type of religion, it can tell you stuff like that.
it can, yeah, it will definitely tell you something. It'll definitely, it'll give you instructions. You know,
It will. It's up to you whether you want to believe them or not, but you're free to believe them if you want to believe
so
them.
yeah, so that's it. And but a lot of people these days are quite disenfranchised with religion. You know, it's like
Understandably.
religion doesn't seem to be particularly particularly useful to a lot of people these days, modern people.
And was it ever? But for most people, I know some people were able to operate within a religious paradigm and actually be it worked for them, I think. But I think for the masses, it didn't really work. I didn't really think it helped people. I don't think people became more conscious. I think they became more dependent because, like I was saying earlier, the whole thrust of Christianity is taking away our responsibility in the act of, in that process of becoming
Yeah,
aware.
wasn't that's a lot of that is influenced by the letters, Apostle Paul and the letters of Paul, and he was the main originator of this idea that you cannot be saved through your own works, but only through grace.
Okay, that is hitting the nail on the head, isn't it?
So that
Yeah,
comes from Paul, and he massively
that was a
influenced
long time ago.
modern Christianity. Yeah, Paul on the road to Damascus had the vision.
Yeah,
Jesus talked to him and said, "Why do you persecute me?" And he had a conversion because he wasn't a Christian. He was
yeah,
working for
the Romans or something. He was
yeah.
he probably wasn't a good
He's,
guy from the.
well,
He
I don't
probably
know.
wasn't.
I wouldn't know.
Yeah.
I'm not going to condemn him. I wasn't around back then.
I don't know anything about Paul before
I
he
don't
got
know.
converted.
I don't know.
I couldn't say
I
what
know
sort of a
that
guy
he
he
had
was.
this. He supposedly had this. He reportedly had this experience on the road to Damascus, and he had this conversion experience. And then he became like he went from being like anti-Christian to being
To the
like
premier,
the
the
number
number one,
one
really.
most devoted Christian. He has this quote where he says something like, "It's not I that live, but Christ that lives in me," or complete identification with Christ, at least from in that particular quote. But yeah, he was like super absolute, 100% for a Christian sort of activist doing. Really, I don't know a ton about his life. It would be very fascinating actually to see some autobiographical stuff about because it seems like he had a pretty interesting life. If not, if you can say anything, if you can't say anything else, it seems like he had a pretty interesting life. But yeah, he is often cited as being the originator of the idea that you cannot be saved through your own good works, but
Yeah.
only through grace, which kind of says that in a way, it like takes the agency away from you in a way outside of just deciding that you're going to believe in this doctrine.
It's kind of, it seems a little bit complex to me because obviously, say, if you're a Sufi, what they say is you can't fix yourself,
Hmm.
but all you can do is just, if you are to be fixed, it will happen. So there's a Sufi story about there's a woman, I think it was one of the few women Sufi masters, and her disciple said, if I repent, will God forgive me and save me? And she looks at him and says, if God bestows his, no, that's it. It's like, if I repent, will God bestow his grace on me? And she says, that's not, you got it the wrong way around, really. If God bestows his grace on you, then you'll repent, which kind of takes that agency out of you completely. And he's thinking, okay, it's kind of flip over. But at the same time, to get into that position where you are able to have not so much belief but faith and put yourself in a difficult situation without trying to seek salvation or without trying to seek it, it it's what Yates called negative capacity, that the situation of existing in uncertainty and not being freaked out by it, going along with the uncertainty. Whereas belief, there's no uncertainty, and so
Hmm.
there's no
There's a
belief
kind
comes
of
from that.
there's a kind of an openness which has to precede
Yeah.
the experience of grace. Seems to me like that there's, and so in so much as there is the active participation of the individual, it's not so much about them doing something per se, but just more of a relaxing of certain attitudes and a kind of just an opening up. Nearly, it's like if you want to. I mean, you can make some very prosaic examples. It's a bit like when you say if you're meeting people that you haven't met before, and there's a kind of if you do that with a form of openness, and you have it, there's a form of trust, even though you don't know the person, so they could just as soon as you meet them, they could just stab you or they could steal all your things, but you decide I'm going to act as if this
Mm,
person is friendly,
decent, yeah, decent human being.
benign. I'm gonna decide, even though I don't know, I'm gonna choose to take this attitude. And then because you've taken the attitude, you're actually way more likely to have positive experiences with people.
Yeah, that kind of is
And
like
so,
the spiritual formula that the less you risk, I think. I think it was the guy who wrote The Road Less Traveled says this, kind of from a psychotherapeutic point of view. The more you risk, the more you are. The less you risk, you become nothing. So but in spiritual terms, by risking everything, that's the element, the sacrificial element, isn't it? By only when we risk everything will anything come back to us. If we're
Mm.
not prepared to do that, we're stuck in our own private prison cell of our own thoughts, and because we're not willing to make that risk,
Yeah,
which
it's
is
a
kind
bit.
of exactly the same
Yeah,
as
a
what
bit
you're
like the
saying.
idea that, say, if you let go of all of the things that you're clinging on to desperately, this
Which is the
idea
least
that,
likely thing you're going to do. If you're going to take a kind of
yeah,
a list of the least like most unlikely things you're going to ever do, that has got to be the head of the list,
yeah,
isn't it? That
but it's kind of behind the act of doing that. There's nearly is like some kind of basic faith or a trust that you won't be left in this completely destroyed and impoverished state, because you think, if I let go of all these things which I'm attached to, it would be a natural enough assumption to make that I'm going to be without all these vital essential things. What will I be without them? I'll be nothing. It will be a sort of a death, and I'm going to just, it's my own sort of, I'm going to be without these things which feel like are completely essential. So what does that amount to in terms of when you imagine that outcome? Doesn't seem very good. So
it's not attractive
in
anyway.
order
Yeah,
to go through the process of just actually, I guess it happens in different ways, doesn't it? Some people, it seems like they let go out of just sheer desperation, like Eckhart Tolle. That makes me think, like he let
his
go.
story of he was suicidal and totally depressed and feeling like shit, and then one day just thought, fuck it. That's not his
Like
version.
at that point, it's like you're not even really concerned if letting go will result in death. You might even welcome death. So it's not even so much that you are trusting that you're going to be in burst. You let
Because
go of
that
all your
wouldn't be
things.
a very spontaneous act, would it? That'd be like, well, that's like belief rather than faith, because faith doesn't have anything to support it, whereas belief does. Faith isn't, no, you can't say, I'll
Not
have faith
rational.
if you, yeah, it's not a rational thing. It flies against everything rational. But that just brings back the idea of this big split between the two ways of understanding things. I know there is this thing called the imitatio Christi, where we are exhorted to imitate Christ. And this became taken two ways because it probably was 150 years after Paul. They were having meetings and saying to systematize what Christianity was all about. And one of the things that the Gnostics are saying, even like in the Gospel of Thomas and all of those Gnostic Gospels, it doesn't mean we imitate Christ. It means that we become ourselves or we search within just as Christ did, which is not an imitation, it's an inspiration. But as a result of the deliberations of the Council of whatever it was,
Nicaea.
Nicaea, they said, okay, no, imitation means here's the source, X outside to us. We deny everything inside, which is denying our divine connectedness. The Gnostics were big into this. Every single person has a denied connectedness, which is like a type of knowing, which they called something, which is a type of knowing in the Greek word. That's all you need in the world to differentiate between what's good and wholesome and what isn't, what's true and what's false. That every single person is born with that, and that is sufficient. Then that didn't the later developments of Christianity say no, that little thing inside you is Satan whispering to, which has an echo in Islamic things. There's this whole idea that we should never listen, that
Yeah.
Satan is a whisperer who
Well,
whispers in the ear.
there's a basic idea in Christianity that there aren't revelations don't happen anymore. So revelations did happen at one point during
And they were cool.
The New
They were good.
Testament.
Yeah, it's like,
Revelation,
yeah, all the
there were prophets and there were people having genuine revelations
burning
from
bushes and stuff.
Jesus and God, but there was that ended, and so there were no more revelations. So if you think you have a revelation, that is just the devil, which does
Exactly the
seem
same thing.
somewhat arbitrary that revelations would be briefly a thing and then they would cease to be a thing.
It sounds contrived, really, doesn't it, to suit the purposes of
Sounds
the
a
organization
little
of the
bit too
church.
convenient, but that seems to be part of the more modern Christian. I don't think if you were, say, most when we talk about Christian, it's a very big umbrella. So it's a massive generalization, isn't it? But in general, I don't.
Mainstream, you can still look at the mainstream of Protestant and
Yeah,
Catholic
I
and
think in general, revelations are not super popular. It's not like a thing which is, if you are, say, a Catholic priest or a Protestant a priest or a minister of some kind, or if you come out and you say, I have a revelation, and God's actually he's got some new stuff he wants to share.
the latest update. It's kind of like an update for the operating system or something, isn't it? He says, here, I've got a new patch for you. People aren't going
I
to.
mean, Lord knows that we need some new patches. It's been a while since we've gotten
It
some.
has. And kind of the stuff we've got doesn't really relate to the modern world so much. It's great if you're a shepherd
Getting a little bit out of date, slightly.
yeah, a little bit out of date.
Metaphorically, and the metaphors are definitely they're not so apropos these days.
All the metaphors are basically about lambs, really, aren't they? It's a very much a sheep herding religion. I can't remember who said that,
Large
but everything in
emphasis.
it
Yeah.
is just going to get.
No, you disappeared.
I'm about to lose power.
You can see your chair now. It's reappeared.
It's come out of the background. Okay. But if you look at that change in the emphasis in Christianity, what it really means is that there can be no more wisdom, because wisdom can only be coming from within it. You can't get someone else's wisdom. Like they say in the East, and probably they say it in other places as well, you can't become rich by counting your neighbour's gold. Even if you count all day and all night, you could count as much as you want. At the end of the day, it's his gold, not yours. And it's exactly the same with wisdom or connectedness to, I don't know, religious revelation or something like that. But that meant at that time you're totally in the power of the system. Totally, you're totally disempowered. You're totally no longer autonomous. You're a function of that system, which is a horrific shift in terms of mental health, really. Because our only chance of mental health is autonomy. And I was having a discussion with someone the other day, and I think if you want to say what is mental health, autonomy is just about sums it up, really. Whatever autonomy means, it means that you are your own person. You're not being manipulated by neuroses. You might have neuroses, but they're not making you see the world in, you're still seeing it from some other place. So that mental health is throughout the Christian church, that robs us of our autonomy, our mental health. And the current society where we place all our belief and trust and shared knowledge, as you say, is also a complete loss of mental health, an utter loss. It's not just a loss of mental health, it's a loss of us because we're no longer there. We haven't actually been born into the world. We're there in potential, and we have this kind of shell that kind of stands for us in a type of tokenistic way. Hi, I'm Nick. I'm the system's version of Nick, but there's nothing behind it. So instead, we have this tokenistic representation of ourselves, which we think is us, and we never look any further than it. So if you wanted to look at what mental health could, mental ill health could look like, it would look like that. But then people do get anxiety and depression and all the rest of it, and you say, oh no, it's mental ill health. But really, you could say, if you look at some of the things that people say, the schizophrenia, people are putting ideas in their head and they're being controlled from outside, you could say, hang on, maybe these guys are saying the truth from within in their own
Hmm.
way. And then the rest of us, of course, say, oh, they're completely mental. They need to be given antipsychotics and whatever shit. So the truth itself, the personal revelation of autonomy, is itself a sign of mental ill health in current professional society in that case. So the whole thing is prevent us ever realizing what's it's kind of no it's no wonder people are so mad into conspiracies because if you look at that as a conspiracy, it's kind of conspiracy behind all other conspiracies because
Yeah, it's the idea that there is some kind of a con or a trick. There's some major, profound that is occurring, that's happening. But it's kind of, and so people are maybe they're intuiting that there's some kind of a discrepancy here between the reality that I'm being told exists and what's actually happening. And then that can, yeah, you lead to just general distrust of what of
institutions and
yes. And that's, yeah, that makes sense to me. That could be a basis for why are conspiracies pervasive? Why is it so popular? Someone who is into conspiracies would say, well, that's because all of these conspiracies exist. But if you're not taking the position that all of the conspiracies,
They
because
can't all
obviously
be true at the same time, can they?
that's the
It'd be
problem,
pure
isn't it? Is
chaos.
that there's different, there's a lot of conflictual conspiracies, but the general idea that the face value reality, the reality that we're presented with, is not. There's more going on, and it's actually that's even a very mild way of putting it. Really, it's not so much
Isn't
of
it?
more. That's not so much that there's more going on. It's that we're living in an upside down world, basically. We're in the upside down in terms
What
of.
we think is good is actually evil, and what we think is evil is good. So it's kind
Yes, there's a kind of a huge chasm between the two things. But
it's
it's
got to
interesting,
be an uncomfortable thing, isn't it? That's a very uncomfortable awareness to have.
and it's very
Uh,
destabilizing, and it could really be probably if you don't know how to if you didn't know how to integrate that into some kind of functional myth, as Jung would talk about, like you're having a personal myth, or that people
mm.
always need some kind of myth to live with.
And
Um,
then you're actually living mythologically, which is a more universal and deep way rather than
yeah, so
you live in a mythological way.
simply being chronically distrustful of everything around you
Doesn't help.
in and of itself, it's not life affirming. It's not necessarily going to be a container for a good life.
And you're not going to grow as a person as a result of that. You're just going to turn into this conspiracy nut, having not a very good time, really, not
You're going to
having much.
become socially probably quite isolated and not able to form relationships. And yeah, it's not, that's the sad aspect of it's really one of the worst things that can happen in terms of the conspiracy side of things is you just lose your basic ability to trust anything, to have to it's a bit like nearly becomes solipsistic in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's a thing called the Truman Show delusion in psychiatry. I don't know if you heard of the Truman Show delusion. What it is kind of like when you suddenly think, my family isn't my family, they're actors paid to pretend to be my family. The whole thing is an experiment being conducted on me. Nothing's true, nothing's real, it's all a setup, which is obviously exactly what's true for Jim Carrey. That was totally true. That he's only discovered that his wife wasn't his wife. And that when he wasn't looking, she was doing product placement, saying, I always drink this because and he's thinking, what the hell is she doing? The whole thing's
Yeah,
all
that's a
very
good
set.
movie. I should go back and watch that at some point.
Isn't it a good movie?
Um,
So in psychiatry, you do get people saying exactly the same things. They don't get it from seeing the film. It comes up quite spontaneously, and it has done since before the film was made. But these days, sometimes it gets called the Truman Show delusion. But the interesting thing is that it's a very raw represent understanding of what reality actually is in that sense. And that the Truman Show delusion is really, and I was trying to have this discussion. I did have this discussion with one psychiatrist who also happened to be a philosopher because he did a master's in philosophy in New York beforehand. And he was able to handle that because he had the philosophy side of his brain. So the idea is that the core philosophical myth that relates to this kind of thing that we know about would be the Gnostic myth of what's her name, Sophia, giving birth to giving birth to the demiurge.
yeah.
So then what the demiurge does, because he's incredibly powerful, he simulates reality and he becomes the boss, the king, the lord of it. But it's all a simulation and it's all a put on show to trap you. And so that's a psychological state. Maybe this isn't real. Maybe I am being kept captive and being fooled by some ape all-powerful agent, which hasn't got my. If the all-powerful agent had your best interests at heart, you'd say, oh, it's okay. But the all-powerful agency is still totally
Hmm.
not in your interest. And that's the core of the Gnostic myth, that our situation in life isn't a benign God. It's this master trickster.
And isn't it interesting that if, say, one of these people who are suffering with one of these situations where they think everything is fake around them, they're suffering because of this, and they're not able to relate to people and relate to their family, and it's not a fun experience, I'd imagine. If
Pretty much of a revelation to realize that none of them are your family. You still have that feeling, but one day it just goes cold and you realize you're being manipulated in a cosmic way.
yes, like what it reminds me of this kind of this idea that basically like a small amount of knowledge can be a very dangerous thing, or if it's or it's a bit like when people have these really out there psychedelic experiences but outside of any real container. Like
Mm.
traditionally, people would take psychedelics within a context of people around them and a tradition and a mythology, and it would all be contextualized, and they would be able to integrate it and given an example of here's how you live, here's what you do with that knowledge, and here's how you live with that in a way that is you've not just become a sort of a ruin of a person and just
In a state of horror and kind of torment because
kind
of
of
that.
yeah just paralysis and yeah. So this idea of yeah, if actually that was more. I was watching this video of this guy who was a Jungian and a psychiatrist, and he was talking about how Jung's theories about treating psychosis were that you could think of psychosis as a sort of an immune response by the psyche to trauma, and that a lot of if you look at a lot of people who basically become symptomatic with these schizotypal types of psychosis, that if you look into their case histories, a lot of them come from very difficult family dynamics and situations, and it's nearly the way he was talking about was nearly like this. The psychosis is nearly like the psyche is attempting to fix something, to heal something. And it relates to this sort of alchemical process of dissolution in order to form something
Reform.
new that is more,
Better.
yeah, better,
Maybe not better.
more whole, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, no
Young
whole.
was a big
Yeah.
fan of using whole as a,
Whole is a good way of
yeah,
putting it. It doesn't imply value judgment or comparison, really.
yes, but so this idea that actually the idea would be that it's an organic, a bit like inflammation in your body is a process. It's an immune response to injury, and it's part of a healing process. And so he was thinking of it. See, Jung's theories around psychosis were basically saying this. They're saying this is essentially what's happening with these psychological breaks in the psychosis, and that if you actually let the process continue and also facilitate it, nearly like how a shaman would facilitate someone undergoing a ritual psychedelic initiation, or to facilitate it and to validate it, to empathically witness that person's experience and validate their experience, and, and,
Respects it,
and realize
not to
that
think that they're
to
just a
look at it like
nutcase.
their psyche is working something out in a mythological way, and that if the process is allowed to complete and it's not attacked by the environment, by people in the environment, that it can result in essentially a new personality being reconstituted out of that chaos. So it's nearly this sort of disintegration, death rebirth kind of process, where the personality was so problematic because of these family dynamics that they just it wasn't viable. And so it's like the personality has to be dissolved and then reformed, and the psyche's like taps into these archetypal roots in order to use as the building blocks of this new personality. I'm obviously paraphrasing. It may not be 100% accurate in terms of what he's saying, but actually the interesting thing is there were people who picked up on Jung's ideas about this, because Jung, I think he reportedly used this approach to some degree with his own patients. And clearly, when he talks about the way that he would interact with some of his patients who were experiencing what would be considered very high degrees of psychosis, and they were telling him that this woman who she told him that she lives on the moon and there's vampires are after her, and I can't remember the whole story, but he wouldn't just condescendingly just like
Sure on
sort
the
of like
head.
pat them on the head and be like, that's
That's nice,
nice.
dear.
Yeah, take your meds. He actually listened to them, and he listened to them. He genuinely listened to them, and he was genuinely interested in what they were saying. And then he was able to find these mythological correlates with what they're saying, and he was able to not so much explain to them what this mythologically symbolically means, but just the fact that he was a empath. He was there present, and he was genuine. He wasn't like frightened by them. He was able to
Interested.
be genuinely empathetic and in a way validate their experience, and to be able to see how their experience, even though it's not, he wouldn't necessarily believe it's literally true, he'd be able to validate the value of it and the truth of it on a level of symbolism and on this symbolic level. But anyway,
Yeah, it
this,
makes sense. Does make sense.
yeah,
I think it shows a split between contemporary psychology and Jung's approach, is that contemporary psychology will not take any interest at all. And in fact, it's considered very bad form to listen to what patients have to say
exactly,
about what
yeah,
the
yeah,
voices are telling
yeah.
them. You're not supposed to do that. You have to ignore it all because it's all illness. And what nurses and what we would hear a lot is that's the illness talking. That's the illness. That's just over. You're no listening. I'm not going to listen. I'm not going to listen. Fear-based, basically a profound disinterest in something which is actually a really, really rich and fertile and interesting thing. Because if
Mm.
you listen to what people going through this say, it's fascinating. It's way more interesting than listening to what the rational psychologists and therapists say, which is excruciatingly tedious and there's no good in it.
Mm.
They're just repeating what they've learned, what's totally sterile.
No, they're
Compared
very
to,
rich. They're rich mythological experiences that they're having, and there's value that the psyche is doing something. And if you take the view, which is so rare in modern psychiatry or psychology, that there is potentially some kind of teleology, that there's some purposiveness, there's something meaningful about the symptoms, that it's not just some epiphenomenal, oh, the machine is broken,
who
and
cares?
this is
Yeah,
just
if a
some,
machine's broken, you don't take any interest in its output anymore,
this is,
do
yeah,
you? It's just an
exactly, yeah. But what's interesting is a couple people picked up on Jung's theories, and they were actually, for a few years, they were implemented. I forget the name of the place. I really didn't do a good job remembering his name, but there was a guy, at least one guy, psychiatrist, who took his theories and actually put it into practice. I think it was a psych ward or not just a ward, but a whole, what do you call it? Like
apartment.
yeah, some department in the UK, and they documented everything very, very well. Eventually, they couldn't get funding, so they had to close it. But they did a post-treatment or whatever they call it, like an analysis of. They went and visited all of the patients to get a sense of what happened to them after, like how successful was it, and they found that the recurrence rate was, I believe, they said 15% recurrence rate. And this was actually a lower recurrence rate, significantly lower than the ordinary approach that they were using at the time in to treat these people. So it actually, there is some concrete examples of, it's not just some crazy wacky theory that Jung had, like maybe you can you could treat people. It was actually tested, and it seems to be effective. And those results were produced in a fairly small span of time, just a few years, and I'm sure they could have been improved upon, because with any of these kind of things, it's not like you find the optimal way of doing something in just a couple of years. It takes a while to iterate and to really figure out the best way of facilitating and doing things like this. So I'd imagine
But there
that.
might be promising signs. You might say, okay, that's promising. I'll continue
Mm,
with it,
exactly.
despite all
So
the
it's not like they
difficulties.
would have completely mastered the process after just a few short years. But yes, so that was really interesting, that the idea that people see, okay, someone is having a mental breakdown, it's only downhill. But this Jung's idea is that it's a larger process, which, yes, it involves disintegration, but it's disintegration that eventually will lead to
The
reintegration.
wholeness. And that's the alchemical formula.
Exactly. The solutio.
Solve coagula, or whatever it is.
Yes, which I don't know all the particulars, but I do have the general sense that yes, it's the sort of dissolution and the re-emergence, re-solidification. Coagulo is to coagulate, to reform.
Yeah, that happens to be something that I remember probably it was like about 40 years ago. I was reading a book on complexity theory. And one of the ideas in complexity theory is that when a system reaches a certain point of its throughput or its energy is getting too much, the old dynamic regime no longer suffices. It needs to find a new way of doing things. And that might sound a little bit fancy, but you can see the same thing happening with fluid turbulence every time you turn on a tap. Now, if you turn on tap just a little bit, the water will trail out like that in a very simple way. That's the best way for the water to come out. If you belt it up really strong, you'll see the water will go into an instability phase and then it'll reform in a different way. All natural systems will go into an instability phase where it's pure chaos and they'll come out on a higher degree of order. And lots of people have picked up on what this means. It means that the system is finding a new dynamic regime or the equivalent of wholeness in terms of what we're talking about just by letting it do its own thing. The answer will come. And Stuart Kaufman, who was a doctor who also became a Nobel Prize winner in complexity theory, said it's like he called it order for free. Because normally we believe that anything that instructions on how to be have to come from the outside. So if you program a computer, that information, the coding has to be worked out. But what he's saying is if you let the system go into instability, information will come from free, from nowhere, not really telling us how to be on a higher level, but somehow manifesting itself in that way. But it's not, it's going through the dark night of the soul and the period, the grace that could come
Yes.
after that.
This,
So it kind of
this idea
correlates.
that when things are falling apart, that's actually can be part of a larger
Yeah,
process where they're
it
coming
is.
back
Because if you
together in a
don't do
better
that,
way.
all you do
Or,
is perpetuate the core assumptions or errors over and over again. And because of our fear, we don't want to let go of those core assumptions. And we'll just keep on validating them and we'll never ever change. We'll just be re-perpetuating. We'll
yes,
never
I
have
mean,
that experience of gaining wholeness or
it's very indicative of a general distrust of in the human psyche. This idea, like if someone has depression, the assumption that
trouble.
this is really just the system is out of whack, and there's this distrust that the system there could be any possibility of the same way that with the body, which is it's maybe more common for people to be aware that the body has an autonomous healing capacity, and that it's like frequently the body actually has its own innate intelligence in that regard. But to just simply just extend to the mind, to the psyche, that's not quite. That's people are very distrustful of that. Someone could naturally and endogenously heal themselves. Their
Yeah,
psyche could heal itself from something as dramatic as like
as apparently destructive as that.
yeah. I mean, we have a very pessimistic view of the mind's ability to heal itself.
Yeah, the psyche, the process. In fact, there is a denial of the psyche in modern psychology. It's not a word that can be used because the psyche implies a kind of autonomy that we don't admit it to have, really. To us, it's just a machine. You
Yeah,
know,
psychology is mostly concerned with the individual parts, isn't it? The behaviors and the
mechanics.
affects and the thought processes. It's like it
And
breaks
yet
it
the
down to
core,
just discrete
yeah,
parts.
it does. It's studying the things it can study. And I know Jung said that. He said if psychology persists in only studying stuff that can be either validated yes or no, that can be proved or disproved, it will become nothing. It'll end up in a dead end and it'll be irrelevant. And the studies of psychology will be totally irrelevant if they insist on only talking about things that can be proved or disproved. He said if it just stays up lab psychology, it's going to peter out. It's going to turn into an absurdity, which is obviously, absolutely, obviously true. I remember picking up a copy of the British Journal of Psychology, and they were doing an analysis of kind of the mental processes of someone playing cricket before what goes on in their head. And you think, okay, they're very technical and you hurt your head to read it. The main thing about it was entirely boring and you wouldn't gain anything from who gives a damn? Is it interesting? Does it inspire? Does it resonate with anything deep down in it? It's pure technical
What's the real
bullshit.
import of it?
There is no real import of it, and there's nothing
Yeah.
psychology, rational psychology, can say that is interesting because it's merely a reflection of what we already believe. They're trying to refine it to solve the problem without realizing that their solutions are actually the manifestation of the problem. But I think we don't respect, as you say, we don't respect processes of great suffering. We think that's Trump has got on record of saying he doesn't respect soldiers who got injured or captured. So they're obviously losers. Do you know what I mean? So you can't relate to them basically because you'd be frightened of death. You want to have this kind of Superman hero that never shows any weakness. So there's this whole way of looking at things that we're afraid of looking at the darker side of life or difficult challenges like depression.
We
And
don't
because we
want
don't,
to disintegrate.
I suppose putting it simply, that's what it comes down to. We don't want to disintegrate. And if we see others disintegrate it, we don't want to know about it because that might make us disintegrate. We don't even want to know about it
Yeah,
because it's such a frightening thing.
part of us is very, maybe you could think of it like a bit like this idea of the psychological immune system, that there's part of us that is aware that this thing
Mm,
is held together with like bubble gum and with the paper clips
yeah,
and duct tape, and that
we
it wouldn't
know.
take a lot of disturbance really for this whole thing to just fall apart. In terms, when I say this whole thing, in terms of like our psyche or our view of the world, our personality.
It's our way of being in the world, isn't it? It's a
Part
whole total way.
It's like we could be feel very reassured and very sure of ourselves and feel like we're very, we're a very solid, robust kind of thing. But I think that there might be it might be possible that on an unconscious level, we're just the same way that people who are in denial of their mortality, on some level, they know that they are subject to the same things that all these other living creatures are subject to. But we can repress that basically. We can repress knowledge of certain things, So it's if we've seen other people, we're aware that people can become depressed or psychotic or that these things happen. We obviously must know that it can happen to us on some level. So,
Yeah, so
um,
it's the immune system, like you're saying, operating without us knowing it. There's a sociologist or guy called Irving Goffman who used to spend a lot of time hanging out in prisons and institutions and mental hospitals, pretending to be a cleaner or something so he could do some research on what's going on. And he was saying that the original, I think he wrote a really classic thing on institutions and the key things about institutions. And he was saying that the original purpose of psychiatric hospitals wasn't to cure people, it was to take them out of society, wall them up somewhere so we don't have to look at them and be disturbed by them. That's what psychiatry originally was. These kind of big mansions in the country with big high walls, and just get them out of society so we do not have to be have our immune system
mm,
compromised by exposure to
there
them.
is something people find mentally ill people. They're the stuff of horror movies frequently. They're the settings of Stephen King type stories because they are just disturbed. We associate with there's something about someone who has lost their mind or they've lost touch with reality that is very frightening to people.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, so you end up not treating these people well because for you they represent a threat to to this crucial immune system. So people are not respected. And I think even without working with people in such or even without there being a kind of thing where people get better or do integrate this contents, if you can be with people in a respectful way, this is a tremendously different experience from being with people who pathologize you and the kind of like that. And when you look at the whole thing about being a professional mental health worker in the old fashioned, it's this huge distance there that patient and you, huge distance. And basically you're disrespecting them because you're denying their reality, which Kierkegaard says, if you deny someone's reality or judge them as being this or that, you're actually destroying them. It's an act of pure
Yeah, I mean,
aggression and violence.
with this guy he was talking about Jung's approach to psychosis, one of the things he was talking about was that there is a normal tendency for people around the person experiencing psychosis to essentially when they say that what you're experiencing that's not real, it amounts to, he didn't use the term gaslighting, but it reminded me very much of the idea of gaslighting because
It is, yeah.
what they're being told is what you're
You're mad.
experiencing is not happening. So, your experience of reality is wrong, and they're being told that again and again, and it has
Don't
this
believe it. I
effect.
think I'm wrong.
It has this
They'll
well,
internalize it.
it has this effect more, I think, more commonly that the person draws. They feel like they just feel completely isolated and alien because but either way, whatever way you look at it, the idea is that this is massively contributes to the suffering
Yeah,
involved in the psychosis is that people essentially, even if they're not meaning to do it, they're essentially gaslighting them because they're telling them that their experience of reality is wrong. And part of that is this guy's point was that it's mostly because if psychiatrists or therapists, whoever, if they were able to if they had more of a symbolic mythological understanding of reality, they're more well versed in mythology and symbolism, they would then, that would give them the ability to affirm the validity, even if it's just on a symbolic level, of the person's experiences, and therefore the person would feel like they are understood. And this is in terms of
Yeah.
the nuts and bolts of the actual treatment part of it. It's not even so much about educating these people about all these different things. It's just the basic human part of the person feels like they are being genuinely listened to and understood on some level. They're being affirmed. Their experience of reality is being affirmed. That is, like, you couldn't overstate how medicinal, how that is,
How
like,
good that feels when you're in a
therapeutic,
situation.
how
Yeah.
therapeutic it is. And it's
I
in other
used,
in other context, it's well understood, the idea of validate, empathetically affirming people, but
yeah.
not in the
We
case of
talk about it a
psychosis.
lot, don't we? We talk about validating people the whole time these
Yeah.
days, whether it's minorities or whatever.
But not when they think they live on the moon and they are being attacked by vampires. Then we go, oh, that's now I can't validate that. Yeah. That's
Yeah, I could think of stories exactly like that. There's a lady I met a good few years ago, but she must have been about 65, normal, nice lady, perfectly normal. But she was driving a car in Connemara. She saw these bikes parked up on the side of the road, and it looked like they might be in trouble. So she pulled up to see if they needed help. Bikers, but when she got closer, she said they looked like Hell's Angels. She realized they were angels, not Hell's Angels, but actual angels.
heaven's
And they were
angels.
like, and she said she was amazed. She was absolutely amazed, and she was there for a while. Then she went back to her house, and she had a few more signs. I think one of the signs that you have a little kind of Catholic thing, which is the heart of Jesus. Jesus opening his chest to show his beating heart, which has a ring of thorns around it, causing the heart to bleed. Kind of bizarre, kind of a thing,
Mm.
but you get it in all houses in traditionally. Don't know what you call it. Jesus' bleeding heart. She could see the heart beating, beat, beat, beat.
Wow.
So she ran to the priest, said, I just met angels and I came back and whatever, I saw Jesus' beating heart. And so he said, and this is what she told me, it's not me you want to be talking to. It's the lads down in the psych. So he arranged it. So she go to now his primary job is to understand those metaphoric, understand that in a symbolic way.
Yeah.
That's his job. But instead he sends her to psychiatry, who are very rational. So there's no way they're going to be interested in hearing that you met angels. There's no way any more than if you say God spoke to you. They're going to have no straight away. That advisor is going to come down and they're going to treat you according to the rules that we have for
So
treating
the
people.
tragedy is what could be an otherwise powerful, numinous, and maybe very meaningful and even life transforming experience is pathologized. It's like something which could actually be seen as a form of a gift from the unconscious or wherever you want to say it comes from. Is turned into, it's turned into this opposite. That's the tragedy of it, is that if there were people around that person who were able to understand that, yeah, these experiences happen and frequently they can be very meaningful and life affirming experiences. And they could be, actually, Jung's contention was that he wrote this in a letter. He wrote this somewhere very soon after he had this experience where he had a heart attack, and had these visionary experiences, and he wrote that basically it is the numinous that is it's the experience of the, I'm paraphrasing, it's the experience of the numinous that heals. So pretty he placed great emphasis on this idea that really the ultimate goal of therapy is to have numinous experiences, and that's where the real healing capacity is. So you talk about someone having, like, that instance, if that was contained, if that was held in the right container, and she was able to talk to the right people, that could be like a really life affirming, a really healing experience to have. So that's the real tragedy of it, is that this it's
It's being pathologized, as you say, instead,
yeah,
which turns the blessing into a curse.
yeah, exactly. There's something about that which is particularly tragic that happens, and it must happen all the time, because
Yeah.
that is the
And
norm.
in all cases like this, as you call it, the numinous experience or the numinosity. Actually, that's a psychosity. It's a psychosis. That's the bad thing. You want to stop. We're trying to
Yes.
block out the numinosity, basically.
That's because there's no room for the numinous. We don't have a belief in the gods anymore. There's
Well,
no gods that
it would damage our immune system a lot to have any numinosity going on.
certainly, yeah. I mean, it's a massive, massive threat. But that is the real revolution would be if people who are having these experiences were able to actually were able to have these experiences affirmed by people around them, and then themselves, most importantly, themselves, and then able to actually have this as to cherish those experiences and be like, look, you've made contact with something that is really extraordinary and really on a much deeper level of reality than most people are experiencing.
Our normal experience, because it's non-numinous, is essentially redundant. It's just a repeat of what came before. And that seems like an extreme way of saying it, but as far as I'm concerned,
Mm.
unless an experience is a break with the normal reality, it isn't real. It's a perpetuation of a
So
mind state.
it goes back to this idea that it's really, if you take this perspective, if you take like Jung's perspective seriously, the status quo, the paradigm as it stands, we really are in an upside down world here. Where what is actually the most therapeutically healing thing, what is the basis of sanity in a lot of ways, from Jung's perspective, is seen as pathological. So it's a totally inverted paradigm that
It's
we're
not
in.
just a gulf between the one paradigm and the other, a gap. It's actually an inversion, like you're
The
saying, which is,
numinous is pathological.
yeah,
That which should be seen as like the wellspring of all sanity and healing in life, from like Jung's perspective, is seen as,
or traditional, a lot of traditional societies.
yeah, Jung was taking this stuff from a lot of different places. He wasn't originating all this stuff from just his own imagination. Obviously, he originated a lot of stuff. The Red Book is very creative for
Personal,
sure. But
kind of, yeah, it's from him.
he's
Yeah,
tapping into the same source.
the
Yeah.
raw current of whatever it is. There's another fellow I know who, like, he's been around. He lives somewhere in Galway, but when he talks, nobody can make any sense of him because he doesn't talk in a normal way. But he was talking to me one day, and he was talking in a kind of a way that at first I just couldn't comprehend at all. But what kind of made me suddenly understand a little bit more about what he was saying. He was talking about being in Connemara or somewhere, and he was saying that he was talking about his stones, and he's saying his stones were like giant boulders. I was thinking, what do you mean by your stones? Like, don't be stupid. You look down towards his testicles. That's my stones. But then I was thinking, but how can your testicles be giant boulders? But then I do remember reading things that Jung had said about the idea of Homo Maximus, the man who is everything. The man who is everything is a motif in lots of fairy tales and stuff. And it's saying, okay, my hair is the forest, my eyes are like the moon and the sun, the crevices in the mountain are my mouth. Do you know? And when you look at the world, that is you, the Homo Maximus. It's not the individual you; it's the universal. It's the university. So when you realize the guy is actually experiencing stuff which makes sense in terms of this motif of Homo Maximus, he's not actually his individual self. He's simultaneously experiencing um, this universal self,
He's dipping
who
into
is,
the archetypal.
yeah. And the wind is his voice, and the sun and moon are his eyes, and the mighty forests on the mountainside are his hair. Literally, it's not just poetic.
No,
It's
I mean,
significant.
Jung's the way Jung put it was that the psyche is real. Psychic events, experiences are facts. They're psychic facts. And just because they're psychic facts doesn't make them any less factual. He really stressed this, and I think it's one of the most difficult things that people would struggle with Jung's ideas is this idea that the emphasis he put on the psyche being real. A lot of people are like, what do you mean by that, real? But his idea is that the this the psychological aspect of reality in terms of these subjective experiences, they are equally real, if not more real than physical reality. That was what he was trying to. I mean, that's when he talks about the objective psyche. He's trying to get people to look at this thing. There is a there is an autonomous reality to the psyche that it's
And that is a very hard thing for us to get from coming from where we are, isn't it? One thing that I remember reading about where Jung was talking about the kind of the watery world, the parasympathetic world, and he was saying everything is versed in it. So in this watery world, the world where we're suspended in this kind of in this water or whatever it is, it's like I could swim up to a fish or a fish could swim up to me. And my normal modality is the fish is my object. I'm looking at the fish, I'm knowing about the fish. But in the psychic world, when a thing comes up to us, and it could be something out of a dream, the really unsettling thing is that isn't an object of my knowledge, but it's actually, look, it's real and I'm not. I'm the object and it's real. So they're just jumping over like
hmm,
that. But actually, your own reality, which we would say to be the factual reality, is inverted. The dream is realer than we are when we encounter that dream and we look at ourselves through it. And we're just, we're the unreal ones, basically, in that. You see
nearly
yourself
like
in,
the physical reality is like
yeah,
from the
it's basically.
perspective of some of these psychic realities. Then
And yeah, so the object that I'm seeing around me is the real reality. And it's actually the subject. You can flip over and suddenly see actually, that's the subject, and now I'm the object, the
yeah,
person. I'm just an object of that.
what you're talking about is basically what in the Red Book when Jung is having these dialogues with Philemon and these various other figures which he encountered in his what he later called active imagination, his introspective. I don't know how you call it, these sort of very deep inner experiences, inner journeys that he went on, without the aid of any psychedelics, which is it's very interesting that he was able to do this without any chemical assistance. But basically, these figures like Philemon would be going at these great lengths to argue and to demonstrate and to basically to convince Jung that they weren't simply fragments of his imagination, that they had their own life, and to try and get him away from this sort of reductive, dismissive way of thinking about them, and trying to establish to him that and it worked. Eventually, he came to think of these figures not as just these aren't just his creations, his little things that he's contrived, and no, that they are not just their own autonomous beings, but they are far wiser than him. So Philemon was like a tutelary figure in that he was like this old wise man trying to impart concepts and things which are ostensibly it's a bit like if we traveled back to the caveman era and we're trying to explain to the cave. It's a bigger chasm than that. That's to trivialize the chasm between the apparent knowledge these beings,
Archetypal figures, or yeah,
whatever you call them. I think Jung granted them an ontic reality.
yeah, they don't have it. They're not our projections, in other words, because a lot of people seem to popularly misunderstand Jung as talking about our projections, and then there's
Mm.
something nice and tame and safe about it. But that's not really the way of it
No, he
at
was
all.
very, very insistent that there's an ontic reality to an ontic classification. Like these things can be seen as being having a independent existence.
They're not aspects of myself. I used to have a lot of kind of debates with my boss, like years and years ago, Una, about
Dangerous
what you
territory.
see. Yeah, it was dangerous territory, but she was interested. But she would listen and listen very interestedly, but she wouldn't. Her way of thinking was more or less conventional in this particular respect, which was that the thing or the entities you encounter when you're psychotic are projections of your own self, and that they're worth relating to because they teach you something about yourself.
It's like a
Point.
watered down version.
Yeah. What I was trying to, even that is a more respectful way of
It
looking at
is.
psychosis.
Yeah.
But what I was saying is that you don't get it. They weren't me. They were powerful. As you say, they have their own ontocracy. Compared to them, my being is nothing. Yet they, even to say, look, they're real entities doesn't do justice to them.
Yeah.
Even to behold them and to have
They have more
interaction with
reality
them.
than your earthly personality.
Yeah.
Your,
So
you know,
even a little bit of a psychotic experience, maybe a few hours worth of it, more packed into it, more to unpack, more stuff. That's years and years of normal existence as we see it through the rational lens. I was trying to say, even a little bit of it is more real than our world. So much more in it. It's
Yeah.
hard for us to handle. That it says in the Bible, you can't put new wine in old skins because
Mm.
if you do, the skins will burst.
Yes, and then you have actually you also have the which is part of the illustration that I've that has for some reason I've chosen for the podcast is Jacob wrestling with the angel. And there's this idea that okay, he's wrestling. What's the angel is a numinous being. He's a messenger of God, and so the idea is he's wrestling with the angel, and in the process of wrestling with the angel, he's wounded in the thigh, and he never is able to. Yeah, he walks with a permanent limp after this encounter, and that actually
That's how the
plays it
Fisher King.
exactly. It's because it's a wound in the thigh as well, and obviously the fish is the symbol for Christ and for the numinous as well.
Unconscious content as well.
Yes, and it's also there's a weird connection between the Fisher King and the Irish myth about what's the guy who ate the salmon of knowledge.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
anyway,
I know the guy you mean. He wasn't supposed to be eating it. He was churning it, but a bit of hot fat was in his hand, and he licked it like
yeah,
that because it was,
and
and straight away
what
he
was
had
his
the
name
knowledge.
again? Was it Fionn or what was it? What was the
Could have been.
guy's?
It could
I
have
wish I could
been.
remember
Like
that, but
I know the Welsh version because
there's an interesting thing about that though, that in that case he eats of the sound of knowledge and he actually becomes a great leader. He becomes an extremely powerful individual, powerful, wise, respected, like a world leader essentially in his own domain. And an interesting part about that is that there's an emphasis in the Fisher King that he's this young guy and you're out there, and he's a bit seems a bit naive and a bit untrained or unseasoned, ungot. This is out there in a sort of adolescent thing. There's very all these variations of the story, but the interesting difference with the Sound of Knowledge, where this guy, I wish I could remember his name if it's Fionn or, but he's in years. He's basically before he eats the Sound of Knowledge, he's actually training with this very famous female warrior in the woods, and then he only gets sent to live with this other guy who's been seeking to catch the salmon knowledge for 12 years because they find out that he's in danger. He's got there's always this very common story as well, is that these orphan type special orphan characters are in danger. Some king trying to kill them and they're having to evade the king or the whatever the established authorities. So he's sent, but the point is that in that story, he is like very well trained before he eats the salmon knowledge. And so that
he's
may,
not an adolescent, gawkish, and
yeah.
greenhorn.
So it to me that nearly like hints at this idea maybe that if we were properly paired for an experience with the numinous, then we wouldn't necessarily be so wounded by it, or maybe we wouldn't be wounded by it at all. Maybe we would just have this positive boon in our lives if it was. But yeah, that is interesting. This kind of idea that there's so much potency in these experiences that you can blind yourself with just a mere fragment of the numinous could permanently blind you, and it has to be very
It can be very destructive. It
yes,
can annihilate us, but without any boon, as you say,
yeah,
receiving a
it,
boon.
it all
So you can be
yeah, it makes me think
dodgy
of
and you're caught in this position. So, like the Fisher King, or maybe more, I interrupted you. And what happened to Jacob as a result of wrestling with
was
angels?
okay. So yeah, he's permanently wounded, but it's even more complex because the wound, which seems like on the face of it like it would be a bad thing, it sets up the rest of the story because his brother Esau comes along the road with his entourage and sees Jacob and says, "Hey, we're going the same direction. You should come. You should follow our caravan. Come with us." But because he was injured in the thigh, he says, "I can't. I have to walk. I walk at the same pace as the women and the children." So because of that, he couldn't follow his brother. So he had to go. He had to take his own path. He couldn't just join with his brother, and that kind of sets up a lot of the other things later in the story. So it becomes a kind of quite an important thing. The fact he is wounded. So it's this idea that a wound can actually, the wound in itself could be a boon, or could be it could ultimately be like a very important, influential part of someone's story, which obviously you can find
It's
examples
not
of
a
that.
curse.
Yeah.
It's not a curse, then. It's not a curse, even though it is a curse in the sense that having a
I
wound
mean,
that won't
so
heal
it's somewhat
obviously a
different
curse.
to the Fisher King wound. It's hard to see how that was beneficial for the Fisher King because he was just in agony the whole time, and then he's just waiting for this guy to the prophecy to be fulfilled, so someone comes and rescues him from the
Oh,
situation.
yeah,
Um,
it's a different kind
but
of thing.
but
That
anyway,
reminds me
just
of,
the what's interesting is this theme of these characters having experiencing something which is so potent that it is the potentially very. That also reminds me of the Ark of the Covenant. That's a numinous thing. It's the Ark of the Covenant, so it's a numinous object.
yeah, like in Indiana Jones.
Exactly, yeah. That's my source for all my
Yeah. It didn't
reference.
do the fucking Nazis any good. They soon learned about that, didn't they? The
Yeah,
bloody old Nazis, that'll learn them. Yeah, there's a Dutch fellow called Johann Fabricius, and he says, looking at it from an alchemical point of view, he says that psychosis is more like a type of malign creativity. Like it's not a repetition of the old white various time, but it's totally creative, totally new, and yet proliferates and proliferates everywhere, and it becomes unbearable for our to live with that much proliferation of the creativity becomes, he calls it a negative, the creativity itself is a negative force. Now, the only reason that would turn around for you, because we try to keep everything that creativity normally would like it to be in our service and we can be a bit creative, maybe we can make some
yeah.
money,
We,
you
we
know.
want a genie in the bottle.
Yeah, yeah,
We don't want him out of the bottle.
to do our service. But
Yeah,
when the creativity becomes too much, it's like the genie's out of the bottle and he won't go back in again. And so the old way of doing things will never work. Somehow, some tremendous shift actually takes place where creativity is no longer for us. It's serving some higher end. It's not that we're trying to harness it to benefit us, because we do tend to utilize creativity. It's such a precious thing. There's
it
not
can
many.
make you rich and
Make you
famous.
rich and famous.
Yeah,
It can do all
absolutely.
sorts of things. It can put people on
People
the
love
moon.
creativity because it's a rescuing from the sterility of the general consensus reality, which is appallingly lacking creativity. So when we get a bit of it, it's great. A little bit of porridge is nice and yummy. Too much will kill you.